Yo, what up, and welcome back to Pnoid News. So, before we start this video, I'm gonna put my opinion out here because I think it's important you understand like where I stand before we get into Russia, Ukraine, all the extracurricular shit. My opinion about American diplomacy across the world is that we should be a neutral nation towards everybody. That we have no business in the affairs of other countries. We have no business having ties with other countries that don't involve trade. That we should not be defending our corporations overseas. That we should not be interfering in the governments and cultures and places of other countries and other people's nations and citizens. We should not back up one country for another, as it were. And I do believe that our current policy and our policy of the past 20 years towards a country like Russia has been extremely antagonistic, especially for a country that actually technically was really born in 1992 under Gorbachev when the USSR fell. We should have had an open hand and been very diplomatic and happy to have them as an ally. They should have been our closest ally. Problem is that our politicians have a very hard time forgetting in our State Department and, how do I put this? Our government bureaucracy has a very hard time forgetting the past and changing its position. Because we spent 50 years fighting a Cold War and expecting a hot one to come, and then it never coming. And today we are engaged in a country called Ukraine over a region called the Donbass and the Crimea. Now, the Donbass and the Crimea were regions during the USSR. This is from 1917 until 1992 that housed a lot of Russian diplomats, soldiers, border individuals, people who did trade back and forth between Ukraine and Russia. And even before that, did a lot of trade in Russia. These are people who were trading wheat back and forth, things of this nature. And the individuals in the Donbass are culturally Russian, speak Russian. This is about 38% of the country. Just like Crimea as well. That's why like the Crimea is about 90% Russian. The Donbass is about 70% Russian. Now the question is, what do we do with these people after the USSR falls and they're no longer in the same nation anymore? But they're still Russian. In the end of the day, they speak Russian. Like the president of, Ukraine doesn't speak Ukrainian. He speaks Russian. What do you do with these people? Well, what they decided to do since 2014 is to bomb them. Not because they wanted their own state or they wanted to join Russia, but because they wanted autonomy. In the same way that places in Spain, like Catalan, have autonomy. In places like Italy, like the northern regions have autonomy. Places like Canada, where Quebec has autonomy, right? They're still part of that country, but, they basically, have more free reign over what they do. Because, ethnically, they're on their own. They're their own thing. They're not, Ukrainian. And I'm just telling you what's exactly going on. And in 2014, there was a problem in Kiev in a place called the Maidas, right? Or the Maidan. This is a market. And This Maidan ended up having protesters go through it, and there were snipers who some say were trained by the U.S. Intelligence agencies like the CIA to shoot all these protesters, and a bunch of individuals died. And then, again, the U.S. intelligence agencies and the Ukrainian government, through their hold on their media, sat here and blamed everything on the Russians and turned the entire population against the individuals in the Donbass. And in retaliation, they have been shelling and shooting thousands, tens of thousands of people over the past 10, 11 years, well, 8 years, to the point where in March of this year, Putin decided that he was going to go in and defend these individuals. Now, Putin has never stated that he has had any intentions of taking over Ukraine, but he did have the intentions, and he filed this with the United Nations to show that he wanted to make sure that these individuals were no longer massacred or genocided, because that's what you do. That's what it's called when, you sit there and you kill an ethnicity in a country, right? It's called a genocide, right? A genocide is not when you wipe out a population of just a country. It's when you wipe out, like when one part of a country, an ethnicity, wipes out another. That's why, like, the Holocaust is considered a genocide. The Armenian genocide is when the Turks who took over Armenia tried to wipe out the Armenians. Right. This happens quite often. You know what I'm saying? The Hutu and the Tutsi and whatever in Africa. Right. This happens a lot. But, it's something that, countries who are larger around these countries try to help prevent. It feels like it's their responsibility. Now, whether or not, the Russians are acting in their best interest is their, prerogative, right? Like, everybody does things like, Don Rumsfeld said, never let a good tragedy go to waste, right? So this is where we are today. And basically what the Russians have been doing is the Russians have been taking out the weapons and the weapons caches of Ukraine that they've been using to bomb and to shell the Donbass. That's why, like, they haven't, taken and held, large cities. They just want to get rid of the weapons caches, and then they move on. So that's where we are today. And ending this requires a rethink of our entire ideology towards this conflict and our entire ideology of the world as a whole. And I think John Mearsheimer has an idea of how to do that. So we're going to check this out, and I'm going to chime in. Let's get to it.
The motion that Steve and I are defending is that to best bring the Ukraine crisis, this geopolitical crisis, to an end, it's important to first start by acknowledging Russia's interests. So what we're talking about here tonight is how best to end this crisis. We're not talking about who started it, who should be blamed. We're not talking about whether Vladimir Putin is a good guy or a bad guy. The question here is how best to end it. Now, this is referred to as a geopolitical crisis in the motion. My view is that it's much more than a geopolitical crisis. This is a geopolitical disaster. First of all, look at what's happening to Ukraine. This country is in the process of being destroyed. The war is only 78 days old. If this war goes on and on, you can only imagine what's going to happen to Ukraine. Estimates are by the World Bank that over $60 billion worth of damage has been inflicted on Ukraine. Some people say that it will take $600 billion to rebuild the country. Thousands of people have been killed. Cities have been destroyed. 5 million people have left the country. 6 million people are internally displaced. 13 million people are living in combat zones. For the sake of the Ukrainian people, it's essential to bring this to an end. Furthermore, we run the risk here that this war, which is now between Ukraine and Russia, is going to turn into a war between Ukraine and the United States. It's going to turn into a great power war. This is a really scary thought. We know very well that when wars become long wars, they tend to escalate. And the last thing we want is a war between the United States and Russia. And the reason is because the threat of nuclear war is on the table. Now, many of you might think this is not a serious possibility, but that would be a fundamental mistake. You should understand what America's goal is in this war. America's goal is to inflict a decisive defeat on Ukraine, number one, and number two, to bring the Russian economy to its knees with economic sanctions. If you listen to General Austin, who is the Secretary of Defense, he's basically talking about knocking Russia out of the race.
Now, Ron Paul spoke about this often. He said he thinks that sanctions are actually an act of war, and he's not wrong, right? And especially when you're the United States and you have the amount of weight that you do. So in sanctioning Russia, you literally are declaring war, right? And what we look at it as United States citizens, we look at this in the way that most Western people look at our criminal system. Right. And I say most because it's not me. Right. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think of things this way. Like, when I hear that you're going to go and arrest somebody for committing some bullshit, like, like tax evasion or, like running a red light, driving out of license, things of this nature, and you go to their house and you pull them out of their house, I look at that as you're kidnapping a human being, throwing them in shackles and throwing them into a cage over money, right? But as American citizens, we see this as us being, like hard parents towards other citizens. And when we do this around the world with sanctions, we kind of see it the same way. But if you could imagine being a different country or a person of a different country, and the United States starts doing this to you, and your kids start going hungry, or you have problems with your job, or you lose your job, or like crime ticks up. Like, I had lived in the Rust Belt when like they shipped all those jobs over to Mexico and China and shit and automated a bunch of them. And I watched my city turn into fucking chaos, right, as a kid, and like watched all the adults I know, all the adult males go to jail for things like child support because they had families and they didn't have jobs, and then they put the women on welfare and the women put the dudes on support, and then like the dudes couldn't have jobs because like all the jobs got shipped out. And this expectation of just, you're going to be okay, and it's looked at like we're just, being like, oh man, well, you got to adapt, you got to do better, you got to change what you're doing. That's an act of war towards a human being, right? And like long term, it breeds things like terrorism. It breeds things like dissidentism, and it breeds things, that end up reflecting harshly on us. Because like when you do these type of things, you are basically destroying another nation. You're destroying other people as a thing. And me personally, like, I look at this as a human, right, who lives, in a country that, yeah, like we're super secure because we have two oceans, like I say, like, we have weak fucking northern neighbors. We have stable northern neighbors, weak southern neighbors, and our eastern western neighbors are fish, right? Like, I get this mentality that like we're untouchable, but we're prisoners on this bitch at a certain point, right? Because like, we can't fucking leave because, like, we're hated all over the fucking world for what we do. And this is these type of things where you go like, man, listen, like, I don't want these people to fucking hate us. And I don't want to be hated. I don't want my government doing things that's going to make other fucking countries and other people and other, human beings hate us. That's kind of where my mental gets down to, right? Just in being a human, like, I don't know, man. Like, maybe I'm wrong. You know what I mean? Maybe, like, I'm not explaining it well enough, but I feel like I am. But let's keep rocking, though.
Ranks of the great powers. This is another way of saying we are presenting Russia with an existential threat. Now, Does that mean that they will use nuclear weapons? Nobody can say for sure, but there is a serious possibility. Avril Haines, who's the director of national intelligence, said on Tuesday when appearing in Capitol Hill that one of the two scenarios in which Russia will use nuclear weapons is if it is being defeated in Ukraine. Well, our basic goal is to defeat Russia in Ukraine. So we have a very perverse paradox here. The paradox is that the better the United States does on the battlefield, with the Ukrainians doing the fighting, of course, the more likely it is that Russia will turn to nuclear weapons, and we might end up in a general thermonuclear war. We have to end this war to make sure that doesn't happen. Now, the motion says that we start by taking into account Russia's interest. This does not mean that we don't consider the interests of Ukraine, the interests of the United States, the interests of Nato. Of course we take into account their interests.
And let me say this, right? Like, I really don't understand why it is that we take into account the interest of NATO, right? Because it'd be different if, like, you know, NATO troops meant like, oh, it's troops from all over the world. That's ours. It's our money. It's our alliance. It's something we built. Well, fuck them. like, why do I care? Right? And as far as the interest of the Ukrainians, we, again, kind of get back to, let's be honest. You know what I mean? If what happened is what I said happened in the Maidan, where the CIA did this, and that comes out, and it actually is proven to be true, and that's told en masse to the Ukrainian people, will they still hate Russia? Will they still stand behind their government? Like, yo, it's a very tenuous situation, and the truth is clouded. It's not just propaganda. There's more to it. So, I don't know. Let's keep rocking, man.
But we start with the Russians, and the reason we start with the Russians is very simple. They started the war. And what we have to do is figure out what their interests are, because if we don't know what their interests are, there's no way we can shut this one down. So we're starting with Russia's interests. Now, the question is, what are Russia's interests? The conventional wisdom, which I'm sure all of you have heard ad nauseum, is that Vladimir Putin is responsible for this war. Vladimir Putin is an imperialist. He's either trying to create a greater Russia or he's trying to recreate the Soviet Union. And what's going on here is that Ukraine is a country that he wants to conquer and incorporate into Russia. He wants to absorb it. There is absolutely no evidence to support that argument. There's no evidence that he thinks that's desirable. There's no evidence that he thinks that's feasible. And there's no evidence in the public record that he's ever said that that's what he intends to do.
Now, all right, we've had this like conversation before on the channel where, like, you know, we stood here and we asked, like, oh, look, if you had like to pick, or if you wanted to like build like, I don't know, like a fantasy roster for your government of who the hell would run it, almost everybody said they want Vladimir Putin running some shit in their government, right? Whether it be their State Department, whether it be whatever, right? Whether it be, you know, I mean, like in general as a leader, right? Because the guy is fucking brilliant. The guy is fucking smart. And I'm assuming he knows what we know now, like about the Azovs and, you know, I mean, like the militias and all these type of things. And in knowing that, and Russia knowing that the West would just stand here and, you know, throw fucking just massive amounts of fucking money at it, and it would turn into Afghanistan, I feel like Russia wouldn't have made any long-term plans to hold Ukraine, because like it would have been a fucking just diabolical nightmare, right? Like there's no way that the West would allow an occupied fucking country in Europe. Like it would have never happened, right? And I feel like Putin has known this from the goddamn beginning. And I really do feel like his plan was literally just to try to take away their weapons caches and, you know what I mean, like basically just reset the fucking government and walk the fuck away. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like that's kind of where things were. But I don't fucking know. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not in his fucking head. I'm not in those meeting rooms. So it is what it is.
This is a crisis that is all about the West's efforts to turn Ukraine into a Western bulwark on Russia's border. It involves a three-pronged strategy, bringing Ukraine into the EU, turning Ukraine into a pro-Western liberal democracy, and number three, and most importantly, bringing Ukraine into Nato. If you listen to Putin's speeches and you read his writings, he has made it unequivocally clear that this is the principal problem: Ukraine joining NATO. And what has to be done here to solve this problem is Ukraine has to become a neutral country. Ukraine cannot become a Western bulwark on Russia's borders. You may not like that outcome, and I fully understand that. But if you are interested in preventing Ukraine from being completely destroyed, and you are interested in avoiding a nuclear war, you should be in favor of the motion. I want to make three sets of points, and they all have to do with data. Mike makes the argument that Putin, along...
All right, so let's have a conversation about the Ukrainians as a whole, right? Politics being what it is, as an in general thing. Having a basic understanding of what politics are, and having an understanding of what and how the world works geopolitically. Knowing that every country who is next to a larger country has to deal with siding with countries around them against other countries. I'm reminded of places like South Korea, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, I'm trying to think here, Liechtenstein. There's a lot of these countries around the world that are literally just stuck between two other countries that are bigger than it and would swallow it whole, right, if they decided to move one way or another. It's kind of one of these things that you just have to deal with as a reality, in knowing that you are reliant upon one or the other. And the fact that us as Americans, as part of the West, we go, oh man, we would much rather you rely on us than rely on Russia. When I don't speak your language, I don't know you, and I have no stake in your fight. It feels like a bad fucking idea for you. Because honestly, and this is kind of like the whole Switzerland, Finland joining NATO thing too as well. I don't know if I'm okay with putting my neck on the line for you. Like I know I'm not, to be a fact. Like I don't know you. You have nothing that I want. And the only reason why this is important is because some larger powers are worried about some corporate interest in Russia and not even in you. God, I can't get behind that ideology. You know what I mean? Like, I just can't.
Or just Putin and a few Russian leaders are interested in Ukraine and the whole subject of NATO. This is what one of Mike's predecessors, Bill Burns, said in 2008 in a memo to Condi Rice. Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russians, not just Putin. in more than 2.5 years of conversations with knuckle draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin and Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I have never met anyone who thinks that Ukraine in NATO is acceptable. Second, to go to Mike again, let me go to Rodden this time. He made the argument that that Putin, in his famous July 12, 2021 essay, made it clear that what he was interested in doing was conquering Ukraine and absorbing it into a greater Russia. This is what he actually wrote. He said, this is in the July 12, 2021 article, "And what Ukraine will be, it is up to its citizens to decide." He also said, "You want to establish a state of your own?" And he's talking to the Ukrainians here. "You are welcome." In the February 24th speech where he announced that he was invading Ukraine, he said, "Accept these new geopolitical realities." He said, "We, Russia, accepts the new geopolitical realities after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. He said regarding Ukraine, "We respect and will respect their sovereignty." There is no evidence in that talk, on February 24th or in his speech that he was interested in conquering Ukraine and integrating it into Russia. And then finally, with regard to Rodden's argument that NATO was a dead issue in 2021, at the June 14th, 2021 NATO summit in Brussels, we issued a communique that said, "We reiterate the decision made at the 2008 Bucharest summit that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance. We reaffirm all the elements of that decision." That argument was repeated in November 10th, 2021. Well, I'd make a couple points. First of all, I think the liberal world order is in tatters at this point in time. I mean, not only do you have a serious conflict between the United States and Russia, but you have a serious conflict or competition brewing in East Asia between the United States and China. The unipolar world where the United States pursued liberal hegemony is gone, and we're now in a multipolar world where security competition among great powers is back on the table, which leads me to the heart of your question. The sad fact is that in international politics, minor powers have to pay really serious attention to what great powers think and what great powers believe their interests are.
And that's kind of exactly what I was saying, right? So it's in America, as a normal white person living in, like a suburban area, y'all are used to just doing basically whatever the fuck you want, as long as you're above board on the law, right? But see, I don't come from these type of places. I come from places in America where, I don't give a fuck whether or not you're legally doing some shit or whatever the case might be. There's not a fucking cop in the world that's going to save you from the biggest dude in your block. And that's just some reality type of shit for you. When it really comes down to it. So when you start having these type of conversations where there literally isn't a world police, where there's nobody who's going to come to save you, where nobody's going to rescue you, where there's nobody there to make sure you're okay, you have to survive on your own. The best you can hope for is maybe a loan from the World Bank, and that's just going to end up fucking your country in the long run. You have to really pay attention to what other individuals are doing, because if you're not the biggest dog on the block, you are reliant in particular, if you're reliant on other countries for resources like fertilizer or wheat or grain or oil or cobalt or batteries or whatever the case might be that helps run your economy, you better be paying attention, because another country could end you tomorrow, and that other country won't notice. That's just the reality of things. And so you have to pay attention to what's going on.
Steve has made this point at great lengths, that a great power, whether it's the United States or Russia, will behave in a brutal fashion if it thinks its interests are being threatened. And the Russians believe that their interests are being threatened in Ukraine, that if Ukraine becomes a Western bulwark on their border, that is, in effect, an existential threat to them. Mike and Radek can disagree with that, but that's what the Russians think. And when great powers think like that, they behave in brutal ways. And my view, and I've long said this about Ukraine, it is in Ukraine's national interest to act smartly with regard to Russia and not poke the Russian bear in the eye with a stick, because it will lead to a situation like the one that you now face. Am I happy about the fact that this is the way the world works? Absolutely not. But I am a realist.
Well, let's also have this other conversation too, right? So I have neighbors on each side of me where I live at, right? And my neighbors on the one side are, white trash individuals. And the dude's an EMT, you know what I'm saying? He's a firefighter. And in general, he's a good guy. But he's white trash. And he's getting massive amounts of letters from the borough about how his yard looks and blah, blah, right? And in doing so, you know what I mean? Like, he needs help. And so, like, I help him whenever the fuck I can. Like, right now, I'm rebuilding this fucking chainsaw so we can cut all this stuff out in the back of his yard. And we can clean up his shit and make these fucking borough people stop bothering him as a whole, right? But that's like something that you do for your neighbors, right? Because like you don't want beef with the people who live around you, right? Because in the end of the day, when all this shit collapses, when Germany's demographics catch up with it, when Italy's demographics catch up with it, when Spain's demographic catch up with it, Switzerland, all these places, right? When all these places are demographically declined and the United States goes, what are y'all offering us? You're not consumers. You're competitors when it comes to manufacturing. Your prices are too high. All of y'all are collapsing. The euro's collapsing. Ukraine's gonna want to have neighbors around it who all like it, right? Where like they can sell weed to and, like they can work together and survive. That's the reality of it. They don't want to be you don't want to be on a war footing with the fucking direct neighbor, with people you share borders with. Like, that's just reality of things. Like, why is this so hard to understand, right? I mean, like, if these were kids, right? Like, if these were fucking kids, and you as like a teacher or a principal went in there, right? And like you seen the way they were fucking acting. And I mean, you sit down and like work out their problems and talk it out. Like, so why do you feel this way? Why do you feel this way? Like, why are you addressing things like what's going on, right? You would have these conversations with them, right? And hash it out between them. You wouldn't make it benefit you. And I feel like that's what we're doing right now.
And I think Ukraine would be much better off today if it had acted according to the dictates of realism. Well, I wanted to actually ask Mike a question, but I'm afraid to ask him a question because he'll go on for another 20 minutes. Look, you just want to keep in mind here what the issue on the table is. We're talking about how to end this war. We're not talking about what happened in Libya in 2011. Really, who cares? The question is, how do we end this war? And it really matters because of what's happening to the Ukrainian people and because of the threat of nuclear war. And the argument on the table is that you have to pay serious attention to Russian interests. And when you talk about Russian interests, it's what they think their interests are. Now, Mike and Radek go to great lengths to try and describe what they think Russia's interests should be. And I think the Bill Burns quote is very important here because Bill Burns, unlike you, said that NATO expansion they have lots of voice. There's no question that the Ukrainians have voice, and there's no question that the Ukrainians have agency. But the problem is, when you live next door to a guerrilla, if you do certain things that antagonize the guerrilla is going to come after you and do horrible things to you. If in 20 years, Canada formed a military alliance with China and invited China to put military forces in Canada, what do you think the United States would do? I guarantee you the United States would behave towards Canada in very similar ways to how Russia is behaving towards Ukraine. We have the Monroe Doctrine, and we would never tolerate Chinese forces in Canada. We would never tolerate Canada forming a military alliance with China. You might not like this, but this is the way the world works. And I believe Canadians are sophisticated enough to know that this is a bad idea. Okay. The argument that NATO was fading in 2021 is simply wrong.
I said 14.
It wasn't fading in 2014, and it certainly is not fading in 2021. Have you ever asked yourself why the Ukrainians are doing so well against the Russians? It's not simply because of Russian military incompetence. It's because we have been arming the Ukrainians, we have been training the Ukrainians, we have been including them in military exercises like Operation Sea Breeze, right? We have been integrating them in very subtle ways into NATO. And furthermore, as I said before in my rebuttal, we have made a series of declarations over the course of 2021 where we made it clear that the declaration that we made at the Bucharest summit in 2008 was alive and well. This is why the Russians were scared stiff that Ukraine was going to become part of NATO. This is why in mid-December of 2021, the Russians made it very clear they wanted a written guarantee from the United States and from NATO that said Ukraine would not become part of that alliance. They were scared, and they were scared because Ukraine was becoming a de facto member of the alliance. Mike's argument is that we don't work out a settlement because that involves appeasing Putin. That involves turning Ukraine into a neutral buffer state. We don't do that. So instead, what we do is we continue to arm Ukraine, we continue to get more deeply involved, and we try to help Ukrainians to decisively defeat the Russians in Ukraine. And furthermore, with our sanctions, we bring the Russians to their knees. And we ultimately, as I said in my opening comments, we knock them out of the balance of power, okay? The question you want to ask yourself, and this is the question all of you want to ask yourself, is where does this lead, right? Just think about what Ukraine is going to look like. Just think about the threat of nuclear escalation.
Well, this is kind of another important thing as well, right? Is that are we okay? And this is something that, like I personally feel as an in general thing is that I'm not okay with our electronics coming from a factory that had suicide nets. All you Apple users out there should feel some sort of kind of way about that, right? And I'm kind of not okay with arming a country that we're not, fucking interested in just to beat somebody else up. We're kind of like gassing up that short kid so that he can take the steam out of the fucking bully so we don't fucking have to. It seems like a really bad, thing to be doing. It's wrong on a lot of fucking levels. It's fucking wrong.
The longer this war goes on, the more likely it is the Americans will become involved. The more likely it is that the war will turn nuclear. This would be a disaster of the first order. We have a deep-seated interest in shutting this one down now. And that means paying serious attention to what the Russians consider to be their interests. And their main interest is to make Ukraine a neutral state. My personal view is that if you got a deal that created a really truly neutral Ukraine, you could get the Russians to give up everything except Crimea. In case you haven't noticed, Putin is not even capable of conquering Ukraine. The idea that he's going to conquer Poland is laughable in the extreme.
They did so many times in the past.
The past is the past. There's a new balance of power in Europe. Build on what Radek said that I wrote in 1993. I was probably the only person in the West who said that Ukraine should not give up its nuclear arsenal. And my argument was because someday the Russians may threaten to invade Ukraine, and Ukraine should have nuclear weapons. The vast majority of people in the West, and many Ukrainians, said at the time that Ukrainians and Russians are basically blood brothers and blood sisters, and that's inconceivable. And therefore, John Mearsheimer's views are out of touch with reality. In a way, Mike, people were arguing at the time views similar to what Putin said in his July 12, 2021 article. Anyway, we took away their nuclear weapons. Then we encouraged them to join NATO. We said they were going to join NATO. We, in effect, poked the Russian bear in the eye, and we left them defenseless. In effect, have led the Ukrainians down the primrose path. I have no idea.
What do you think?
I think that we are living in a world of radical uncertainty where it comes to what this is going to end up looking like. And I think there is a real possibility, I'm not saying it's likely, but there's a real possibility of nuclear use. And I think that should scare the living daylights out of all of us, and that should create an imperative to shut this one down.
It doesn't scare me. Because we've been talking about this since '08, right? I was a Ron Paul guy. We've been talking about this for a very, very long time. Where legitimately we've been standing here going look, we shouldn't be interfering in all these other fucking countries. It's not our goddamn business. You need to mind your business, right? And, a lot of people, looked at us like we were crazy people back then. And still today, there's a lot of these America first morons, right, who, stand here and have this same type of nonsense. I'm anti-imperialism. I'm anti-us being the world police because it doesn't serve us anymore. It legitimately doesn't serve the United States to be doing what it's doing anymore. It doesn't serve the citizens. This is, all about corporate interest and corporate money and old school bureaucracies going to war with each other. And it doesn't help me. This doesn't help Americans. To be a fact, this harms Americans in the end of the day. Because the right of self-determination is, for me, one of the largest ideas that I think we should embrace as human beings. Right? And if your country really wants to be self-deterministic, isn't it important that you, at minimum, have the right to be able to conduct warfare? If you don't have the right to conduct warfare, you don't have a state. That's the reality. And if you don't have a state, then you're a client state of somebody else. And who's the individuals who's stopping everybody from going to war? Think about that for a second.
Yeah, I want to make it clear, I disagree completely with Radek on the point that Russia is an imperial great power and that Ukraine is the first train station on the line. And when they're done conquering and incorporating Ukraine, there'll be additional countries. There is no evidence to support that. It's true if you look at the July 12th, 2021 talk. It's true if you look at Putin's February 21st and February 24th talks this year. This is all about the West's effort to make Russia to make Ukraine a bulwark, a Western bulwark on Russia's border. And the key prong in our strategy is NATO expansion. If you just go look at the documentation, you'll see an abundance of evidence of that. And you can find no evidence that Putin is an imperialist. What we have here is a choice between two bad alternatives. One alternative is we can reach an accommodation with the Russians and through diplomacy work to create a neutral Ukraine. That's one alternative, and it's the alternative that Steve and I favor. The other alternative, and this is the Biden administration's policy, is to double down and to try to defeat the Russians in Ukraine, to bring the Russian economy down through comprehensive sanctions, and as I said on a number of occasions, to knock the Russians out of the ranks of the great powers. That's the alternative. You have to choose between those two. And our argument is that the second alternative is extremely dangerous, and it's going to be terribly damaging for the Ukrainians. It makes more sense to cut a deal here. And what you really want to think about is the one crisis before this that looks a lot like the situation we're in today, and that's the Cuban Missile Crisis. We now know that when the United States got involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis, what President Kennedy did was he went to enormous lengths to shut the crisis down. He cut a deal with Khrushchev. He cut a deal with Khrushchev that he thought was so objectionable to the American people that he told Khrushchev that he was going to have to lie about the Jupiter missiles in Turkey, which he was going to take out, right? Kennedy understood. We were talking back then about the threat of nuclear war. And Kennedy understood that you definitely wanted to do everything you can to avoid that. So what I'm saying to all you folks in the audience is you want to think like John F. Kennedy in this crisis, not like Joe Biden.
All right. And I completely agree with him, like 100%. You know what I mean? Like I've said this since the beginning of this conflict, is that like we legitimately need statesmen. Not bureaucrats, not dumbass state workers, not feminists, not trans activists, not California liberals. We need statesmen. We need individuals who will act in the best interest of the parties that be and act in the best interest of peace. And that is legitimately something that we don't have, because our government and our leaders as a whole, right? And we talk about this, you know, I mean, when we come down to like our cathedral ideology, is that our president is a costume leader, right? He's not an actual like real leader when it comes down. Like he's not really in charge of anything. Like he's not the chief executive of the executive branch. He's literally just a figurehead. And because like if you think about it, like think about, all right, so what would it take to make Joe Biden have the same power as LBJ? Probably had to increase his power, what, tenfold? How about FDR? 100, 1,000-fold? To get him to that power level? To get him to have the same ability? These are things that we don't have conversations about. We don't have anybody in charge to really even make these decisions. And it's acting in the best interest of peace, not in corporate interest, not in U.S. military interest, not in the CIA's interest, not in Britain's interest or Europe's interest. In the interest of peace and saving lives. We spent the past 2 years during COVID talking about saving lives. More people are going to die in this conflict than died of COVID. That's something that we're not going to even have a conversation about. They don't really care about lives because it's not powerful. When an idea is not powerful, it doesn't attract powerful people. Peace It's revolutionary. But it's not a powerful ideology to people. Anyway, yo, look, I'm Tom Peace from Pnoid News. You know the deal. Like, share, and subscribe to anybody who's new here. Thank you for making it all the way through. Peace.